പോളണ്ടിൽ എന്ത് സംഭവിച്ചു? പോളണ്ടിനെ പറ്റി നീ ഒരു അക്ഷരം മിണ്ടരുത്.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi, Harsha.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. We're going to dip into something that theoretically should be a lot of fun, a series on action films in Malayalam cinema.
I was looking forward to doing this series of movies. We are coming off heavier topics, discussing them, watching some movies, and as you said, it's been a non-stop parade of dark Fahad Fasil movies. So I was looking forward to watching, revisiting some of these movies that were a little bit fun because most of them were like super plot heavy, and talking about action in Malayalam movies.
Yeah, and unfortunately, because of me, we're restricted to what we can find in English. So our choices are not necessarily what we might consider the best films, although I do think they illustrate some aspects of what goes into a typical action film and what might be a typical Malayalam action film. But before we get into that, you said you wanted to talk about a couple of things that had come out or a couple of pieces that had come out in the news this week about intimacy coordinators in Indian films.
I was okay with saving this discussion for after we discuss some action movies as well, but the intimacy coordinator is the person who basically, it seems, looks over the scripts, picks out where the director, and they will probably go over and pick out the moments of nudity or kissing or sexual intimacy, or in some cases sexual violence, and they will discuss with the performers what their boundaries are, whether they have some no-touch areas, what is okay being touched, and all of that is spelled out pretty clearly in what they're doing, and the contract is, they're involved with letting the performer know that their boundaries will always be respected, even if they've signed a contract saying, I'm okay with nudity, or I'm okay with doing a sex scene, but then they realize they don't like to be touched in some place. That consent is always respected at every step of the process, and make sure the director respects that as well. And that there is no pressure. This is something that we hear about in the Indian film industry, is that actresses are constantly pressured to show a little bit more skin or do some scenes that they probably weren't ready for or comfortable with. I mean, we're talking about a lot of these actresses are very, very young. We until very recently, we didn't have a lot of women with degrees coming in. So they were starting in their teens, and they were doing pretty intimate scenes. I mean, Indian cinema being what it is, they're not doing hardcore sex scenes, but they are doing, there's a lot of touching, and there's a lot of, especially in dance, in songs, there's a lot of hugging around the chest area and things like that a young person, I mean, certainly any teenager would find uncomfortable, let alone somebody who is 16 and being pressured by her mom to be in movies to support their family. Intimacy coordinating is something that came into being through this theater. Stage productions use them a lot, which makes sense because you're doing stuff live, and there's not a lot of time to break character and negotiate what is happening when you're in front of a live audience. But it's been coming into films in the West since 2017. The story is that Emily Mead, who was an actress in The Deuce, which was a show on HBO, heard about the allegations against James Franco that he was known for violating consent in film shoots with acting students that he trained, and that she wanted some acknowledgement that even if the show is going forward, even if HBO isn't going to fire him, that there's an acknowledgement. So she was the first person to ask for a intimacy coordinator, as far as we know, in Hollywood film and television production. And that person, last name is Rodice, Alicia Rodice. And she's kind of become HBO's in-house intimacy coordinator now. And I know Netflix has one too, Ita O'Brien. So it's slowly like these big production houses have in-house intimacy coordinator. And as they've been doing this for film and television, these two especially, O'Brien and Rodice, have been creating a culture of a new profession basically for film and television, which is the intimacy coordinator and the intimacy director, which is basically like a stunt choreographer or a dance choreographer, is what the intimacy director does for intimacy scenes. And in India, there's been two now who've been trained, and that's what these new articles were about. These two women who are kind of pioneering this industry in India. Their names are Jayalakshmi Sundareshan, who has worked as a costume designer in the past in film industry, and Asta Khanna. So it's been really interesting to see this new profession come, and obviously the fact that most of these intimacy coordinators are women, because I mean, theoretically, there's no issue with a man doing intimacy coordinating, but it seems like a lot of just because of the world and the patriarchal society that we live in, and the film industry being controlled by men, it's been really interesting to see that most of the negotiation is, intimacy coordinators are women, and also that we're not, Asa Khanna says the hardest person to do intimacy coordination for is a heterosexual man, because even he minimizes any trauma he has. And it's the intimacy coordinator's job to make sure that he knows that it's okay to enforce his own boundaries.
But certainly this is coming out of the articles talked about it definitely coming out of the Me Too movement. Although I think some of it, no, if it's 2017, it probably doesn't predate it. But I mean, certainly the stories of issues have circulated for a long time. But it's on some level, it does make sense to me that it's women stepping into this profession, because women have the most vested interest in this. I mean, yes, men can have similar types of issues around boundaries and consent, but it's always been more of an issue for women.
Absolutely. And you saw me tweet to respond to one of the articles that asked Gautam Menon whether he would engage an intimacy coordinator, and he said, "I don't feel the need for such things. My actors are very comfortable with me." Well, I believe Gautam Menon has a foot fetish, because in all his movies he spends a lot of time focusing on feet. Our own little Quentin Tarantino in that case. But there's just like an absolute lack of acknowledgement of what this job actually entails, and the fact that the women he's working with and the men might need somebody who is not the all-powerful director to negotiate these scenes with, especially if you're talking about people who are starting out in the industry.
Yeah, because I mean, it's definitely, it comes down to, issues of who has the power on this shoot. And if you're a newer actor and not wanting to make waves, you might not tell the director that you have some issues around what he's asking for. And you might be perfectly willing to do what he's asking for, as long as you were comfortable with issues of consent and boundaries. And it seems obvious to me, but I guess I'm biased in this instance. But it seems obvious to me that having someone to help navigate those power issues on a shoot could be really helpful.
One concern of mine as we're going through this is that the intimacy coordinator HBO hired was to make up for the fact that they were still employing James Franco. And we don't want this to be used as sort of a fig leaf to cover up, allow men who have a history of sexual violence or harassment in some way to keep working on film and television sets. But I liked to think that, The Deuce was a terrible television series. It was by David Simon, the man who did The Wire. But James Franco is not entertaining enough of an actor. He was in a completely separate series than the rest of the cast, and he was playing twins. It was very strange. So I'm really glad that show is no longer airing, but also that this has kicked off a trend. And, one of the comments in one of these articles was from Rima Kallingal. She's done a fair share of her own intimacy scenes in films, and I'm specifically thinking about the sexual assault scenes in 22 Female Totem. And those things, they're scenes of violence, but, they don't use a fight choreographer for some reason, because they actually, most scenes of violence would use a fight choreographer, but because it's sexual violence, nobody thinks to use a fight choreographer. And one of the things that the intimacy coordinating guidelines that these two ladies in Hollywood have written up is that intimacy coordination is great and it needs to happen in scenes of sexual violence, but also it could benefit from coordinating with a fight choreographer to do what they do, which is focus on the violence part of this. And so, I think that kind of takes us to our action movies, which require a lot of stunt coordination.
That's why I wanted to open with it, because I was thinking it was interesting to think about this in terms of getting into action films, because I think where you're going to find the most problematic stuff in terms of consent and boundaries are in action films. I think we'll see some of that in at least one of the films today.
So these movies were all over the board. These set of four we are going to talk about. Shall I introduce them?
Please.
We chose in release order. We're going to talk about Irupatham Noottandu, the Mohanlal film, Yoddha, the Mohanlal film, Rajamanikyam, the Mammootty film, and The Great Father, a Mammootty film. So this is our Mammootty and Mohanlal action movie episode. I will say that Irupatham Noottandu and The Great Father are not great action movies, in my opinion. And I don't know if there's something about action movies also needing to be humorous for them to be good action movies. Both Irupatham Noottandu and Great Father, I think, are thrillers. Irupatham Noottandu is also a gangster film, but we can get into it. So what movie do you want to talk about first?
I started with Irupatham Noottandu, and that one threw me for a loop a little bit. And that's when I dumped the Wikipedia definition of action movies, because I went, is this really an action movie? The Wikipedia definition actually really helped me with my thinking around these four films, which are all kind of really different. Essentially, it says, an action film is a film genre in which the protagonist or protagonists are thrust into a series of events that typically include violence, extended fighting, physical feats, rescues, and frantic chases. They feature a mostly resourceful hero struggling against incredible odds, can include life-threatening situations. But I can see that for Irupatham Noottandu. I now, having read that, I can kind of see, I think the level of risk here is probably less than in a lot of action films. It's more capery than full-on action, but I can see that. So why don't you summarize what the film's about, and then we can get into it a little bit.
Irupatham Noottandu is about smugglers in Kerala in the 1980s. Mohanlal plays Sagar, alias Jackie. You will have to explain to me later why he needs an alias.
This is a character that Mohanlal will take through a number of other films as well. So it is, to be honest, I have no idea why he needs an alias, but there it is.
So he runs his smuggling business, which is not drug smuggling. It's for all those luxuries that you couldn't get in India in the pre-economic liberalization period, which I kind of always try to put as a marker when we're talking about Malayalam movies, because there's a significant cultural difference in the movies from the pre-liberalization period and the post-liberalization period.
And Mohanlal is clearly at the beginning, he's smuggling gold. But there is a scene with Mammootty, later on where he is smuggling things from the Gulf like soaps and perfumes. And I have to admit here that although the copy on Eros now has subtitles, they are mistimed for the bulk of the film by about half an hour. So I had to sort of, like Urvashi's character, I was like, what's she in jail for? And then about a half hour later, I found out why she was in jail. Anyway, aside. But that is, as you pointed out, it's on the one hand gold, on the other hand goods from the Gulf that people want. And the kicker comes, he's working with a character played by Suresh Gopi, who's the son of Kerala chief minister. And Suresh Gopi's character wants to get into drug smuggling. And for Sagar, alias Jackie, that is a moral line. And that causes sort of the split between the two characters. And that's actually when we really start to get into some of the stuff that really is the meat of an action film.
I have mentioned to you, and maybe in the podcast, that Suresh Gopi was my childhood crush. And I was like, even in this movie, I was like, he's so handsome. He's such a man. So that was my first reaction. And the second is when Mohanlal said, narcotics is a dirty business. I was like, I've heard that line so many times, but I actually didn't know the movie it came from.
And that was in English too, so it's like, I got that, bam!
I did a little clap and I'm pointing at the screen. I was like, there it is.
Well, this is a theme that comes up. I've seen this in other Malayalam action movies too, that go around smuggling, that drugs are the line.
I think that's because most middle-class families have some experience of buying smuggled goods. If you think about Irupatham Noottandu in some ways if you think about it as Malik, but in the time it's actually happening, there's threads. I mean, you're talking about like the same part, like Bhimapalli, that area of Trivandrum where a lot of the smuggled goods are sold. And you're talking about these fishing communities. When they're talking about smuggled goods coming, they use the term chagara, which is in Malayalam is a word for when a gang of fish come up on shore and they're so easy to like capture and get a profit from, or eat the fish.
Doesn't Mammootty's character say something along those lines too?
He talks about when he says the smuggled goods are ready to come in, he calls it the chagara. So that's the code they use for it. We're talking about fisher folk, we're talking about that same exact community. So if you've seen Malik and you want to see where all this originated, there have been movies made about that smuggling operation in the past as well. There are significant differences, one being the caste and community of the smuggling gang being much more mainstream. In Malik, it's famously because they're kind of a subaltern Muslim Christian fishing community, In Irupatham Noottandu, Mohanlal is a foreigner to that community. He's from a traditional Taravada, it looks like an Nair Taravada, from a village with a very proper mom who reads the Ramayana every day. But somehow he's ended up working with this community on his smuggling operation. That's the big difference, but I think there's definitely an aspect of spiritual successor in Malik to this movie.
Definitely, because of the smuggling scenes, and again, like, I come at this like, how is this different from my perspective? And when I hear smuggling, when I heard smuggling in Malik particularly, I thought it was going to be illicit goods, perfume. But the joke in Malik is it's a fishing community, so they need the perfume to cover up the smell of the fish. And I don't mean that in an offensive way, because I come on my dad's side from a fisher family, so I know what this is like. I was actually really sad that the subtitling was off on this, because I do like this film. It's a little bit run-of-the-mill now, maybe, and it's not high on action up to a point. We have that idea of the hero being resourceful, like right in the opening scene where he's driving the blue Mammootty car, and the police are looking for them because they've got the gold, which they cleverly hide inside the spare tire, and they've got the car tripped out to look like a rally car, and they infiltrate a rally to look like part of the rally to get away with the gold. So, we've got this clever, resourceful hero doing clever things.
Yes, I agree that as I said, I think this is more of a gangster film because a lot of this movie, except maybe in the last, maybe 10, 15 minutes, I feel like could have happened on a stage. I got a lot of information from the dialogue, and they're not giving you necessarily exposition in the dialogue, but you'll have random bits of information just thrown in dialogues that you are supposed to connect. In that way, this is a very complex film, and it is very much a precursor to the kind of movies that we are seeing in 2020, 2021. You gotta be a very keen viewer to pick up on some of the information and how the political nexus ties into the smuggling activity to really pick up on those things. And there aren't really any 100% good characters except maybe Jackie's mother, in that everybody's kind of working their angle because of their own individual motivations. It's a very complex film compared to some of the other action movies that we're going to be talking about, where the motivations are a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah, I wrote in my notes this was a contemplative action film. Like, it really was more about the brain stuff than the body stuff. And at times, I guess maybe they didn't have the budget for anything more intricate either, because some of the things they're trying to shoot as action scenes are really like tight angles and left more to your imagination than anything else. Like stuff I could shoot on my iPhone if I really wanted to make an action film. And I don't mean that to denigrate the film, but go in with those kinds of expectations that we're looking at action film in a kind of a niche that is maybe very different from what we think of as action film today. Actually, maybe that's a good time to go to The Good Father, because those are the two extremes. Sorry, The Great Father.
The one point I wanted to make is that the one thing I noticed with this movie, just the way I did with Sreekumar Devi, is the editing is all over the place. Things are just cut in and cut out, and there isn't a lot of continuity. And I think that specifically has to do with the technology available in that era. And there isn't a lot of soft transitions into the next scene, and dialogue is just thrown in. However, we didn't find out why Urvashi's character was in jail. She is Sagar's lover until sort of the last 25 minutes or so of the movie. And then, I had assumed she was part of the smuggling operation in some way because her mother lives in that community, and that's why she ended up going to jail for smuggling. But no, she actually went to jail for manslaughter. That kind of is a through line throughout the movie, that she's kind of the single ray of hope for Sagar, that in a very typical 1980s Malayalam movie fashion, it doesn't end up coming to fruition.
Oddly, I mean, I actually liked that. I'm reminding people that we're spoiling. We've already spoiled all over the place. But I thought the ending was kind of a nice touch, because we have Sagar, alias Jackie, going to prison and crossing with Urvashi's character as she's coming out of prison. Like, it's so poetic in a way.
Yeah, no, I actually, you know that meme that goes, "Ooh, poetic cinema." When that scene came on, I was like, poetic cinema.
Anybody listening, Harsha has her hand to her forehead, like, oi. But it is, I mean, it's a little corny, but it was also a nice time.
I enjoyed it.
They were thinking through some of these things.
Yes. And, we have to talk about Ambika's character, who is a journalist who is the bookend for this movie, really, because she's a journalist writing about underworld operations in Kerala and their ties to politics. And she's very interested in Sagar, alias Jackie. I guess she's the person who writes that in the article, and that's how we as a Malayalam population get the term Sagar alias Jackie. And it's as yet unclear to me why he has two names, and people just call him both.
Well, I mean, clearly, his mother calls him Sagar, and in the smuggling community, he's Jackie. So, I guess at a stretch, we can say that he's trying to keep those two parts of his life separate.
But then we see the Suresh Gopi refer to him as Sagar to his father. And I was like, that's not separate then. prior to this, of course, I did watch Sagar alias Jackie Reloaded, the 2009 movie by Amal, and I only did it because I'm a Big B fan. So I thought Sagar alias Jackie was going to be as good as Big B. It wasn't. But I'm glad I watched it for Shobana, and I wish that movie had actually done some work of picking up where these characters ended up from this movie, because this was such a nice contemplative little action movie, and Sagar alias Jackie Reloaded didn't have any of that contemplation.
It's like if you're going to have a contemplative action movie, it's going to have to come out of Malayalam cinema.
That's true. Instead, what Sagar alias Jackie ended up being was a lot of slow motion shots of Mohanlal walking around, which can take us to The Great Father. Speaking of slow motion shots of people walking around.
Let's be honest, we're not going to recommend this film based on both our reactions on Twitter. Anyway, let me start with a bit of a summary. It's essentially a serial killer, but we have Mammootty playing
David Nyman,
and who is father to a young girl, Sarah, played by Anikha, and it's setting up Dad as a superhero, and Sarah worships her father. And, you know, it opens with her regaling, and in some ways it reminded me a little bit of Ashik Abu's film Daddy Cool, where the child regales schoolmates with the exploits of this wonderful father. I don't know if that was going to be a bit of a callback to that or not, or I don't know. But that was something that went, oh, that's like this for me. But Sarah ends up as one of the victims of the serial killer, not killed. She ends up sexually assaulted at a time when both of her mother's a doctor and her father is a builder, and both of them are involved with work events, and she's left to return home alone. And when her father, David, returns home, he finds her unconscious in an elevator. And his first reaction is, as this superhero father, is to protect his daughter at all costs. And the first step is to get her into the house and isolate her from anyone who could know about this. I already have issues with this because I suppose as a parent, that is the first thought, is I have to somehow protect my child.
I had an issue with that too. I disagree that might be what a parent's instinct is.
Well, it depends on how we define protect the child. I would want to protect my child, but I would not take my child to the hospital initially. I would not get the police involved. I mean, I understand, you know, any of us who have watched Indian cinema know what kind of stigma ends up with, you know, women and girls in these kinds of situations. So it's not that we don't know about that. And I'm sure the same stigma exists in terms of, like, we know that a lot of women are reticent to report sexual assaults, even in the West, because of a certain stigma that gets attached to all of this. But yeah, I mean, how you protect your child is one thing, and this is not the way I would protect my child.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm finding myself a little triggered in this conversation. So, trigger warning. There is a depiction of or references to sexual abuse of children and child rape and things like that. And if that upsets you, as it upsets me, this is definitely not the movie for you. And I found the way that Mammootty reacted very unnatural. You know, he didn't immediately see his bloody child and want to take her to a hospital, which is what every parent would do, you know?
Yeah, I agree.
And I think they only did that for the sake of the plot, which was to set up this competition between Mammootty and Arya's character, Andrew Eapen, the police officer investigating these serial killings. Andrew Eapen is not very sensitive to the actual living child who's left. He's very much like a cold, rude police officer who just wants to close the case. And the tension with him and Mammootty is just interested in protecting his child and not making her have to relive this by talking about who did it. And so that's the central tension.
This is important because I think it speaks to the fact that these issues can be very triggering. To use them as plot devices is a real disservice to the issue.
Yeah. what once again in the competition between these two men, these two actors who play heroes all the time, once again we lose the agency of the young child. We lose the agency of the mother of the child who had the right instincts to take her to the hospital. That, at the end they say, when they keep saying, like, all the adults in her life keep telling her nothing happened to you, nothing happened to you, when that's clearly not what this child is experiencing. She's experiencing something, that the fear of something that has happened to her, the trauma of what that has happened to her. And the movie concludes after, Mammootty has gotten his revenge. It concludes with them saying that nothing has happened to my child. And if, as an adult, she decides she wants to talk about what has happened to her, then that's up to her. Which I think is a fine way to discuss it. It's a fine way. But in the meantime, they show this whole thing of, like, everybody pressuring this child to be okay instead of letting her be, or letting her process the emotions in a way that is helpful for her. And it's very painful to watch.
And I had a question because, in our systems, some of the things that happened in this film would not be allowed to happen. Like, Arya's police officer would not be allowed to waltz into a house and talk to this child with nobody present. He would not be able to manipulate her by getting some kind of social service workers in who harass this girl. Like, I honestly felt ill.
Yeah.
Are there any protections around these things for children in India?
Yes, I don't believe is something a police officer can do, is to talk to a child by themselves without a child protection officer or and a parent present. So yeah, some of the things that he did in this movie wouldn't be allowed to happen.
And he's very aggressive with her. Like, why are you being aggressive to this young girl? Why? Yeah, see, we're both upset about this film.
And in the end, they justify his aggression by saying, I have a child, his niece at home as well. I was like, that would force you to be a little bit more tender towards the child and approach her in a way that, approach her legally, but also approach her in a way that respects her as a person and not just somebody who was tortured by this serial rapist.
And I have to say, like, I didn't mention that it's directed by Hanifa Deni, who has done the only other the film I've seen of his is the Slav in me the way it's spelled. The Slav in me wants to pronounce it Mikhail, but it's Michael with Niven Pauly, and it's the same kind of his films are definitely not my cup of tea.
No, Catherine, it is Mikhail in Malayalam.
Oh, is it?
Michael in Malayalam is Mikhail.
Adeni has a definite style in his film, and I think some of the style is probably what we would think of now as an action film. It makes me think a little bit about, like, Hong Kong action films. I mean, it's not of the quality of a Hong Kong action film, but Hong Kong action films are very highly choreographed, highly stylized, a lot of mood, and that's what he's trying to do in his films. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the style. I think there's some real issues with substance in these films.
I have not seen any of his other movies that I can think of, but let me...
I've seen Michael, and quite honestly, I don't remember any of it. And that was my comment on Twitter, was I thought I hadn't seen The Great Father, and I started watching it, and I went, I have seen this. And I thought, did I see it and stop because I was offended? No, I've seen the whole thing because... I had, the flashbacks once I got through it. But obviously these things bother me, that the content of the film bothers me enough that I block it out. So, anyone looking to these films should be very aware that, particularly in The Great Father, that there are themes here that are very sensitive, that are dealt with very insensitively.
And I think for me, the insensitivity is underlined every time they do a slow motion shot of Mammootty walking away all cool, like a cool guy from any scene with, like, some rap adjacent music playing. There's so much of this movie you could skip through because there's so many slow motion shots of him walking through. And I'm like, why is this happening? Like, why is this child's trauma about this guy walking cool? And I know, like, to the audience that it was being directed to, which is the Mammootty fans who are in the theater, that those are the moments they're supposed to clap and, like, cheer and stuff. But it is extremely manipulative. I mean, and you as a fan, if you're there, you're probably there to be manipulated. But I compared watching this and Irupatham Noottandu, which I feel like have a similar non-actionness to them. Thought to myself, you can do this movie where you make him seem like the great father, the clever father who solves this mystery in a much more sensitive way.
That was Drishyam.
Yes, that was Drishyam as well. Yeah. I mean, you know, I have my own issues with Drishyam too, but where, once again, you take away the agency of the victim. But I will say, Drishyam, in its style, is a much more sensitive film than The Great Father is.
Yeah, but it did strike me how you have these two father figures dealing with terrible events involving their daughters and how they react to it individually, because it's very much about the individual hero avenging things and solving things. Yeah, and some of the writing really creeped me out in The Great Father. Like even Sarah's closing speech where she talks about her father as her first love. Rob was watching with me and he went, ew.
It's really creepy. The Sarah and David's relationship at the start of the movie is really, it's too cloying. It's too saccharine. It's not what you want. Because Anikha Surendran is actually a great child actress.
She is, and I'm gonna interrupt for a second to just say if you have access to the miniseries Queen, she is terrific in that.
Absolutely. She is a great child actress, and especially in something like Queen, where she gets to take center stage. Actually, she and Gautam Menon have a very good relationship in that show, where he's her director and kind of her mentor. And you can see how she looks up to him in that show. And that could have been like the kind of similar relationship that Sarah and David had in this movie, but they like took it over the top. It's disgusting.
Did she have a picture of her father in her room? Did I see that?
Yes, she did.
Yeah, I'm doing my ooh, ooh, ooh. Yeah, it's the writing is not good. The writing is, yeah.
I'm much more in favor of children who think their dads are lame than children who think their dads are the best. And, you know, we get a lot more of dads who are lame. Like in Drishyam, all the kids think he's super lame. And you know, comparing this to Yoddha, which is another one of the films we watched for today, you can deal with kids in a really affectionate way without making it cloying. And Malayalam cinema has done it so many times. I don't know why they get so weird about these upper middle class kids with their dad who like they're obsessed with. I've seen this in a few movies, and I think it's, you know, maybe in Daddy Cool it's like that. I haven't seen Daddy Cool. Bhaskar the Rascal was an okay movie in my opinion. It was definitely watchable. In that, poor Anikha Surendran has to sing a song to her mom played by Nayanthara called "I Love You, Mummy," and I don't know why these movies go so over the top with the kids' attachment to the parents. We need to talk about why Mammootty loves playing these rape avengers.
Yeah, my least favorite Mammootty ever.
As you know, I have a lot of childhood terror associated with the movie Hitler for the same reason. He's not avenging so much as there's like problematic rape content. And I'm not saying that these are Mammootty's views, or, you know, as this movie is produced by Prithviraj and Arya and Santosh Shivan through the August Cinema. I'm not saying these are their views, but I still can't believe that they're making these kind of movies.
Yeah, maybe we should leave it there, because that's my exact sentiment too. Like, why? You can do something else for the fanboys, really. You can. Actually, that's a good segue into Rajamanikyam, because I would like to leave Yoddha for last, for reasons. But this is directed by Anwar Rashid, who we know from Ustad Hotel and more recently Trance. But it's a very different, like he had a couple of films there at the beginning of his career, this with Mammootty and another one, Chota Mumbai with Mohanlal, which were really more massy hero entertainer films. So that's how we're sliding into the action film with this one. So I'll let you give the summary because you're much better than that than I am.
Rajamanikyam is about a blended family, basically. There are two stepbrothers and a half-sister from the parents' second marriage, and Mammootty plays Manikyam, who his mother has to sort of keep a secret at first in her second marriage. And when the new husband, played by Sreekumar, finds out about him, he kind of accepts him as part of the family. But there's clearly a lot of tension because he has his own son from a previous marriage, and the kids don't really get along. And as an adult, Rajamanikyam is nowhere around this family until Sai Kumar's character dies, and his daughter and son end up feuding over the property of their dead father, and his will ends up saying that all his property is going to be controlled by Rajamanikyam. His stepson, who kind of arrives as this billionaire from Karnataka, and he kind of sets to putting his family right, basically, through a lot of beating people up.
Well, and one of my questions was, is this the first time we see a character like this with Mammootty? Because it really, for me, because I had seen Pokhri Raja before I saw this, and it's a very similar kind of character to that and to Madhura Raja, which was the follow-up to Pokhri Raja, where it's Mammootty as kind of a lovable, not educated. He deals in cattle in this film. In Pokhri Raja, he's a gunda, but it's this similar kind of character, and there is an element of it playing to comedy.
You know, when we've discussed that Mammootty does not play, unless he's making an art film, he does not play lower caste people typically. If there's, if between Mammootty and Mohanlal, that's usually something Mohanlal does more often. And I think part of the selling point of this movie was watching Mammootty playing against type. And especially because people say Trivandrum slang is super funny, and as somebody from Trivandrum, I get it, but also, why is he the only one speaking in Trivandrum slang in this movie when, like, his mom could be as well? And it's just because Malayalam cinema can't take us seriously as, like, a person if you're talking in Trivandrum dialect. But apart from that, since I was a teenager, I would hear that the way you guys speak in Rajamanikyam was really funny. And I don't have a full-on Trivandrum slang, but I can switch to it if I want to. But that is kind of the USP of this movie. The unique selling point was that watching Mammootty kind of talk in this like very shrill Malayalam dialect, and also his lines from this movie are very famous. Avan Pulyanada.
I was going to say, like, the point is playing against type, punch dialogues. I think this would be very recognizable as a typical, like, we see this type of film in Tamil cinema, in Telugu cinema, in Hindi cinema. This is where Malayalam cinema has a common ground with other cinematic traditions in India. This
is masala.
Yeah. So, I honestly don't have a lot to say about it. I think if masala films, and if you know what you're going to get, because, you've got Manoj K. Jayan with his red rimmed eyes, and like all these little masala tropes that you will see time and time again. If you're going to like, I actually like Rahman in this film.
Yeah, this was Rahman coming back to Malayalam movies after like maybe a decade or more of staying away from it. And apart from his weird colored hair, I was like, he's so handsome. I totally see why my mom and her generation were crazy about him. And he gets to play sort of the classy straight man to Mammootty's character.
And he's the educated one. Like when they need someone to bring the smarts, they turn to him. Yeah, I did wonder what was with the hair. But I'm in the fandom. Like I think he's lovely.
And you're talking, this movie came out in 2005. So we're talking about a very particular period in Malayalam movies. We're not making a lot of high grade movies with complex plots. So the fact that this movie stood out despite it having a very potboiler plot with the hero getting his family back together to have revenge against this person who's been manipulating things and basically led to the death of the patriarch of the family. I think this movie's it's a credit to Anwar Rashid and it's a credit to Mammootty's charm because he really centers this film and he's surrounded by a bunch of actors we don't really see anymore. Manoj K Jayan being one. I know I actually looked up his filmography. He's been acting pretty consistently, but we don't see him in a lot of the new generation movies that maybe get a lot of press.
No, and I wish we would because I really like him as an actor. And I think in this film, he's playing a very stereotype role. And I don't think you get a good sense of what he can really do as an actor in this film. One of my frustrations, because in looking for what I can find with subtitles and looking ahead to the next couple of episodes as well, what can I find with subtitles? The best films that we put on our list, I can't find anywhere. And the worst films, like from this 2000s era, are all the ones with subtitles. And that boggles my mind. Like if you're going to, I don't know what the reasoning is.
Probably because they want you to pay for the better films.
I would do that. Give me the better films with subtitles. I will pay. But yeah. But do you have any other thoughts on this film? Because I don't.
It does have action compared to the first two we talked about. It does have a lot more action. As my constant complaint is with Indian cinema does not know how to do action, and I always fast forward through it. Just like you, I'm a big Hong Kong action fan, so I'm not even saying it needs to be like a Hollywood style action. I'm not into the guns and explosions action. I just love how a lot of East Asian cinema does action. This ain't it, but it's a very enjoyable movie. It's a potboiler, and you get some good actors doing extremely schlocky roles.
And go for Rahman, because he's good.
Yes, and I will say this movie is very cast heavy. There's a constant cast-based insults going on in this movie, and I think I was taken a little aback because movies these days don't go that far in acknowledging cast. And actually, Irupatham Noottandu also has a lot of cast-based, not as strong cast-based interactions going on and insults, but not as much as Rajamanikyam, because this is in a border area between Kerala and Tamil Nadu. There's a lot of cast-based insults back and forth in all the action scenes.
So that leads us to the last film today.
Yoddha.
Now, I'm going to tell you, when I first started getting into films and I was looking for recommendations, I had a lot of Mohanlal fans say to me, do not watch this film. And I'm going to say that of all the films we watched for today, I think this is my favorite.
So Yoddha is one of those movies that gets aired all the time on Malayalam TV channels. So I constantly watch Yoddha, maybe bits and pieces here and there. But since it released and since till now, it's always been something in front of my eyes at different parts of the year. And it's directed by Sangeet Shivan, brother to Santosh Shivan,
who does the cinematography here, although I don't think it's the best example of his cinematography.
And again, we're talking about 92, 93 period.
92, yeah.
Yeah, 92. So we're also talking about, things aren't as advanced, but I definitely see a step forward from the 1986 movies we've seen. And the music direction, most notably, is by A.R. Rahman. It's his first film that he's done music direction for. And the songs are boppin'.
Yep. So tell us what it's about.
It's about a young Lama in Nepal who is this cult of worshippers of some black magic users. They're trying to kidnap him for their own evil purposes to gain more power. And his protector comes in the form of Mohanlal, who is from Kerala. He is escaping from his village because he and his cousin are always at each other's throats. And so his mother sends him to Nepal to stay with his uncle. And because of mistaken identity and the manipulations of his cousin, he ends up on the streets with the little Lama Rinpoche, Apukutan in this, as Mohanlal calls him, and they bond, and he basically gets drawn into this fight of good versus evil and protecting the young monk from these evildoers.
What people have to realize here, and I think this is one of the things that kind of tickles me about this film, this is actually a mashup. It takes heavily from the Eddie Murphy film The Golden Child. That's the whole plot about the Lama and the good versus evil. And near the end, we get Zatoichi, the blind swordsman. Like, I went, what? Because, and with The Golden Child Golden Child is not a great film, with the exception that it really sets up the whole situation with the kidnapping of the young Lama. And they had more of a budget for good versus evil, so they had industrial light and magic do, the effects. But essentially it's, Eddie Murphy being Eddie Murphy, and that part didn't work for me. So I don't think in Yoddha they set up the situation around good and evil and the motivations of the evil characters as well. But for me, the important part was the relationship between Mohanlal and the young boy. The other thing that struck me, and we've talked about Mohanlal's face, and you've mentioned about his face being incredibly expressive. And I think this is a point, like this film, he is so expressive in this film, and it's really wonderful to watch.
Yes. I think, especially for me, films from this era, and maybe because I was a child when all these movies were coming out, so they're kind of imprinted in my mind. These movies are what make Mohanlal to me, and engender the kind of affection I have towards his face, and that makes me regret the fact that his face doesn't move anymore. It is movies like Yoddha, it's Minnaram, it's Manchatatara, and regarding the good versus evil, this movie, I didn't know it was inspired by those other two movies. I read a lot of fantasy books. It's a very typical fantasy genre, hero's journey type movie, and most of them have that theme of good versus evil. But because it's Malayalam movies, it's scaled out. So all we're really interested in protecting this innocent child.
Yeah, because in the original film, The Golden Child, Eddie Murphy spends very little time with the boy. The boy is kidnapped and in the possession of the evil sorcerers almost for the whole movie. So this is a real departure where the boy escapes and ends up on the streets of Kathmandu at the same time that Mohanlal's character does. And I actually liked that more because I really liked the interaction between the two of them. And the Lama in The Golden Child is actually a very sweet child. And this child is also a very sweet child.
I think there's two really big highlights in this movie for me. Is like the competition between Mohanlal and Sreekumar. I mean, Paragalichan is such a good song, and it really gets you in the spirit of whatever you're doing. It's that relationship, and as well as the sweetness and comedy of his interactions with the child. He's very joking, but also like very immediately like takes to this child, and the child is very loyal and is very amused by this grown man and his living out in the streets. And, I think most people remember this movie for the interactions between Mohanlal and the child as a great example of how not to make interactions with children saccharine and gross. Because this, a grown man and a child living out in the streets could be saccharine and weird, but instead, it's very funny and lighthearted, and their interactions are, because there's also the language barrier. The names they come up for each other is very sweet.
Yeah, and I mean it's less heavy on action than that we might think, but it does have that central core of the hero, as you mentioned, the hero's quest, and the hero, because he's literally called the chosen one. That's very heavy in The Golden Child, but it's mentioned at the beginning of Yoddha, where the monks say that there is a chosen one coming to help in this situation. But I really was fascinated when we took this turn into Zatoichi, the blind swordsman, which is like a classic of Japanese cinema, because we have Mohanlal's character, one of the evil henchman sorcerer people has a powder, and it blinds people, and he throws it at Mohanlal, who ends up blinded, and then begins training with a martial arts master to learn how to fight and use senses other than his eyes. And, magically at the end, his sight, but even, I say that, his sight is restored. But the movie hangs together because there's a scene right in the beginning where we see someone's blindness being cured, resolved by the monks. So we know this is a possibility. And it doesn't, as far-fetched as it is, it doesn't seem as far-fetched as it could be.
Yes, and the funny thing is I don't remember anything. When I watched this movie, I was like, oh, there's this whole part where he gets blind. I didn't even know this because I was all about the interactions with the kid. But actually, that is where a lot of the action part comes in and where you can really call this an action movie.
Yeah, where the unfortunate martial arts come in. I know it's like we keep saying if you're a fan of Hong Kong action, you're going to look at this and go, oh dear, but they're trying.
Yes, and I will say Sangeet Shivan is the director of this, but it also reminds me of Ananda Bhadram, Santosh Shivan's movie a lot. They both really go in on the mystical elements and black magic and all of that, which I think. Malayalam cinema does a little bit of, but it has some real fantastical elements that we don't necessarily see as much in Malayalam cinema. So I thought that was interesting. And I found the depiction of Nepal fairly respectful for what it was. Nobody gets called any slurs, which I am always afraid of.
And the golden child is Rob and I looked at it and went, well, that's racist. Yeah, there was much more of that.
Yeah, it was clearly, when I was looking at this, I was thinking, there's some sensibility in this movie that Nepal is still, Nepalis are still like us in a lot of ways. Which makes sense. Like, a lot of Nepal is Hindu, it's a South Asian country, and it's treated more like North India than, if this movie had been set in like China or something, I feel like it could have gotten a lot more racist if it wanted to. And yeah, it's an enjoyable, fantastical caper and involves a cute kid who is a handsome adult now. I don't know if you've seen him recently, but he was in some Malayalam movie recently.
Did he not play another Lama type character?
He did. I think he played another monk in Irupatham in 2016. Yeah, he was in a movie with Manisha Koirala in Malayalam. That's cool.
He's typecast though.
Yeah, no, he's typecast as a monk.
But again, I'm going to emphasize that if people are looking for older films to really get a chance, there are lots of them from the 90s with Mohanlal to really get a chance to see what he was and what he was capable of. Not that we don't. I think we see flashes of it now, but I think I'm rambling. I'm rambling off in a direction.
No, I agree. This is peak Mohanlal. Check it out for peak Mohanlal. If you don't get what all the hype is, after you watch Christian Brothers, if you're like, you've watched Christian Brothers, like, I don't get it.
I feel like we're fated to talk about Christian Brothers at some point.
You have to take the good with the bad with Mom.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, I think the best Malayalam films aren't I don't want to say that aren't the action films, but I think, I don't go to Malayalam film necessarily for the masala action films. If they're done well, I don't mind, but that's not what I'm looking for necessarily.
Yeah, action isn't a central genre in Malayalam movies. You can find a lot of other genres that you might not find in other Indian film industries in Malayalam cinema, but action isn't one of them. When you do action, it's kind of more a thriller or a gangster movie, things like that. That is why I think we had such a hard time coming up with these movies.
Yeah, and I was just about to say exactly the same thing, that everything we've looked up is more thriller than action, or more something with action tacked on, or a full-on masala film where you're going to expect some action as well as everything in the pot.
And I will say that kind of takes us to what I hope will be our next episode, which is Suresh Gopi and or Jayan focused episode.
I would love that. I would really love that. But again, that's going to be the challenge of subtitles.
Okay. Yeah.
Even for Suresh Gopi, I'm struggling with the subtitles. But let's keep our fingers crossed.
Okay, fingers crossed that next episode we can talk about the heroes that are actually the action stars of Malayalam films, Suresh Gopi and the late great Jayan.
Thanks for listening to the Polandine Patti podcast.
If you like what you're hearing, remember to come back for our next episode and share our podcast with your friends.
If you'd like to connect with us, you can email us at polandinepatti@gmail.com or reach out to us on our Twitter feed @polandinepatti. See you next time.